Okay, so I've been trying to make these videos, and I've been just compiling more and more and more videos on top of everything that I want to make, because the more information that the more things that I watch and the more information that I gather, the more the more I want to know, the more I need to know, the more that there's out there. There's just, a part of me had the thought that this whole, finding the origination of myth, right, and trying to get to the bottom of what came before is more daunting than it was for me to try and create a theory of everything. And I don't know if that's just because I think a part of it is because there's a lot more information about modern science than there is about ancient history, right? A lot of this is we barely have fragments of what we have found, and there's not a lot of people looking into it because no one cares that much about history. However, I do think that there is a lot of importance in understanding our history and where we come from, because it does say a lot about where we're going. And so, I think a part of it is that it was much easier to find digestible and accessible videos and people talking about modern science and what's going on with modern science and the history of science, because there's a lot greater of a focus on that. So it was a lot less daunting to just kind of start watching videos on it and get into it. But that's also one consolidated topic. However, with this, I started with ancient Greece, realized that ancient Greece requires me to go to, Egypt, ancient Egypt, and ancient Egypt also requires the tie-in of the, ancient Canaan or Canaanites or the Levant, right? And also ties in the Mesopotamia and all of that stuff over there. And potentially I also have to tie in farther than that, right? Going out, what is that called? I can't think of what their name is right now, but it's Indo-European. I don't know if that's right. I don't know. Somewhere so it's Mesopotamia, and then if you go farther, more towards India, right? That area there was some kind of ancient civilization that was pretty advanced, but there's not a lot of records on it, I think. But I haven't looked into that area. I haven't gotten that far yet. The problem is the more that I find, the farther my the scope creep on this is insane. The scope creep on this is insane. However, as I'm looking into this, right, I'm finding a lot of connections, a lot of tie-ins that kind of unifies everything back to a similar, thing. However, it's really hard to trace the origin and where it comes from. And I want to say that I don't think that, I'm going to kind of talk through this a little bit, but the biggest concern I have with this is, as I'm trying to do this, I feel like I am becoming a proponent for, not actually, but I feel like by making this argument, I am promoting the idea of European origin and white supremacy. And I don't want that to be the case, because it's just not the truth. But whatever this culture was, I am kind of coming to the conclusion that they definitely valued pale skin over dark skin. And I think the reason for that is because the lighter your skin meant the less in the sun you were, and the less in the sun you were meant less work you were doing. And if you were doing less work, you must have been someone important, someone, you're wealthy and you're too busy, potentially studying and learning indoors and being an intellectual and things along those lines, and not doing any hard labor to get any tan, right? And so potentially it was seen as a status symbol, oh, you have tan skin, you must not be very wealthy because, you get out in the sun, which is ridiculous in the modern day to think. But I believe that this could have been the case at some point in the past. And I think there's historical record of this being the case in certain places around the world. However, because they favored that like skin color, that skin tone, another thing I'm thinking about right now is if there were Neanderthals in the north that Homo sapiens moved into and then bred with, right? If they preferred if the Homo sapien women preferred the men of the north, as I'm going to call them, the men of the north, right, that potentially had whiter skin because having a darker pigmentation was not, or melanin, I think it's the right name, having darker melanin or more melanin or whatever the right term is, was not necessary there. And therefore, because they preferred the Homo sapiens, a preference for white also emerged. And it's not because they were superior, it's not because they were better, it's just because that's where the selective tendency went. And then I'm going to get into it a bit, but I believe that my current theory is that wise women kind of steered the course of evolutionary history. And these wise women chose the Neanderthal men because potentially they were wise as well. Or not, maybe not as like, I will say they were wise, but not necessarily intelligent, right? Because the women had the capability to learn more and therefore were potentially smarter than the common Homo sapien man. And when they came into contact with Neanderthal men, they were like, whoa, you're kind of smart. I like dig that. Whoa. And so because they saw them as intelligent and they were potentially also white, they then, bred with them, and over time, white was seen as a favorable thing because it was seen as, white men are intelligent compared to the Homo sapien men that were not white, right? And therefore, selective tendency went that way. And it's not because, and the reason why they were more intelligent is because they had survived longer and they weren't run by a female dominant society. These were tribal groups, small communities of men where the alpha male was the leader, and therefore if he survived long, he typically was wise because he needed to live through those years and had experience. Whereas the Homo sapien men, because the women were dominating the society, were not, like, they did not need to become wise, right? Because the women were wise. So the men could just do whatever and be the workhorses and the hunters and all that stuff, right? They didn't need to be intelligent. And therefore, basically, the women unintentionally subverted the men, or potentially intentionally, unclear on that, right? But subverted the men. So when they came across men that weren't subverted and were seen as masculine, right? Because basically, I think that these Homo sapien men would be what we call today, I guess, like the soy boys or whatever, right? And so they're seen as like wimps, right? They can't do anything. They're not that, they're incapable, right? And you see it a lot today, and actually like a lot of commercials and stuff. The guy's always an idiot. And I think the reason for that is because a lot of men, for the women, it's like, yeah, he is an idiot. And for the men, it's like, well, I'm not as dumb as him, so I'm going to make the right choice. And so it's kind of like playing on your intelligence there, but that goes into the talk that I just did. And so the thing is that the women were like, well, our men, right? The Homo sapien men are idiots and pathetic. So we're going to mate with the dominant male, intelligent, guy, right? And so even if not all of them, all Neanderthals were the alpha male, right? All the other Neanderthals, naturally, because of the reputation of the alpha, were seen as more favorable to their own. And over time, having that white, knowing their history, having that white preference became, a thing, and that opinion of white superiority became ingrained in the minds of people, basically because of this, mating preference. which is just kind of crazy. Like the amount of chaos that has come from such a seemingly mundane and unimportant choice of who you select to be with, right? I don't know. That's just bizarre. Anyway, and so I think that's where that comes from. And I want to just kind of clarify that, like, I'm not trying to say that, like, Africans in, any other area was not capable of doing this, right? It's not that that's not the case at all. It's just that I think that the people that moved out, that decided to move out of Africa, were intelligent to some degree, and that's why they were like, well, let's go see what else is out there, right? Let's explore, let's learn things, because realistically, if life is good where you are, there's no reason to move. And so potentially life either, I mean, there's two ways you could look at it. Either life wasn't good, life was too good, and too many people started surviving, and so they had to spread out more, or they were just bored and they wanted to see what else is out there. And so I'm going with, it might be a combination of all three, but most likely it was a sense of curiosity, right? Because Homo sapiens slowly, I will say, conquered Africa and inhabited all of Africa and then decided to move out, right? So I think that there is some significance to that. Anyway, I kind of went into a big tangent there. Pretty much what I want to say is that I have a lot to talk about on this, and I haven't really known where to start, because there's just so much that ties in with this, and there's so much information that I'm lacking. And so I didn't want to start talking on it without having information on it. But what I've realized is that I don't know if I'll ever have enough information to confidently speak on this. So the best that I can do is start talking on it, make some opinions, make some theories, give some guesses, right? Put some words out there, and maybe it won't all be correct. Maybe I'll be wrong. Maybe I'll have to correct myself in the future. But it's better to start somewhere and try and work our way towards, a more correct thing. I mean, it's exactly what I did with my theory of everything for physics. Well, my initial thoughts were, I would say, extremely basic and not well articulated. And over time, I started to learn more. I started to think about it more. And I was like, okay, well, this is starting to make a lot more sense, and I kind of changed how I spoke about certain things. And I think that I'm going to try and do pretty much the same thing here. And at the very least, I can put these ideas and thoughts out there for someone with more knowledge and more of a focus on this to look into it and see what they think and see if it makes sense and see if they can tie any connections in, right? So I'm just putting the thought out there for someone else to potentially take further and develop into something a little bit more concrete, because right now these are just my theories, and while I do think there's a lot of connections, a lot of tie-ins, a lot of interesting things that I've found, from my little bit of reading and videos and things like that, I don't think I have all the answers. I don't think that I have 100% truth on this, and I want it, like, I've been going back and forth on the whole, were they just or not just, and I think at some time maybe they were, but it started to decline, and that also led to again, the fall of them, potentially. It's really hard to say when exactly they were wiped out, because the history starts to get overwritten around the time of the transition, right? So we're going to see. But what I'm going to start with here is the cycle of humanity and gender control, because pretty much what happens is we're on a kind of a cyclical track here, where it goes from male dominance to female dominance, back to male dominance, and I think we're transitioning towards female dominance again, or we're somewhere in the middle between those 2 points, and it can be seen just by the fact that women have at least a pretty good standard of equality compared to previous times. And what I've seen now is that there's a lot more successful women than in recent history. So I think that that's important and something to kind of keep in mind. And so basically, at the start, we have humans exist in small groups. The alpha male is superior. This is kind of goes into a lot of ape cultures, a lot of ape groups. I don't know if culture is the right term for apes, but I mean, I don't know why it would be wrong. I don't know. But basically, there's a lot of structures for these communities of apes. There's the alpha, and then there's the betas or whatever they're considered, right? And so that would have probably been the case for humans as well. There would have been the protector, the dominant male that was the leader and in charge of everything, because typically with structure, things just someone needs to be in charge to make the decisions in order for the collective to stay together. If everyone is making their own choices and doing their own stuff, typically it falls apart because everyone's doing whatever they want. And as great as that is, if everyone does whatever they want, it's unlikely you're all going to stay together. And so eventually humans develop communities because they're in small groups here and there, little tribes, but eventually they kind of build relations with other tribes and form communities and grow larger. And as they grow larger, the power is shared among the tribal leaders. So they go from being it's one tribe leader to a group of elders, maybe is the right term, like a bunch of tribal leaders together kind of deciding what happens. You have a council of tribal leaders or something. But then what happens is that the men hunt and fight. And so typically if the men are the ones hunting and fighting, then they're also the ones that are dying. And if they're the ones that are dying, then they don't live as long, right? And so the women do not fight, and therefore typically the women outlive the men. And so when the women outlive the men, eventually over time, the women become a lot more intelligent than the men and have more influence than the men because they are wiser and take over, power. The elders are no longer the tribal leaders, elder men. No, now it is the females. Now it's the women that become the elders because all the men are basically dying. They don't live as long. And the women do, and so the women take over control. They take over influence. They become the leaders of the tribes, and because they become the leaders of the tribes, the power transfers to them, and they begin to control the society. Controlling the society, that allows them to call the shots and how things work. And so naturally, religion and things along those lines would probably also develop to see women as the superior form of human, and therefore the depiction of their gods. And then, with long lives and security, basically, because the women live long lives and are protected, they develop language, writing, and technology. The women become wise because they live long lives and they are safe, right? And so agriculture, because they're wise, right, they develop things like technology and stuff, technology being things as basic as farming and agriculture, right? And so agriculture removes the need for men to die as often, and so they grow older, right? And the men become capable of becoming wise, right? Because initially it was all the men are going out hunting, they're going out fighting, they're doing all of that, right? They don't have the capability to live long lives and become wise because they're basically the fodder for the women of the society. And so the men, once agriculture develops, are no longer they may still have to go out and fight, but typically they're not putting themselves at risk hunting. Now they just farm, so they have the ability to live longer lives in a safe. They're living safer and therefore are allowed to live longer. And since they can live longer, they can also become wise. And so, because they live long lives and are safe, the men learn and become wise. Right? They learn things. They experience enough of life, and they become, what I would say, wise. Wise is a very ambiguous term, right? Wise then is not necessarily wise now, potentially, right? Maybe I should say they didn't become wise, but they became intelligent. Maybe intelligence the proper term here, because if they became wise, there wouldn't be a problem. So maybe I should say intelligent, right? So men had the capability to become intelligent, and so as men became intelligent, they realized, hey, like, why are you superior to us? We're like both humans, like, why is a woman superior to a man? Like, that's kind of not right. Like, we should be equals, right? We should be equal. And the women potentially said, no, you're not our equal, because women are superior and that's God ordained. And actually, the women have all the power, and you are still going to be the fodder for us. The problem is when you have fodder that's intelligent, it doesn't really want to be fodder anymore. And so, equality is denied potentially by the women, though, even though they're technically equals, they say, well, we're not. And the men say, well, screw this. I don't like that. And they revolt, right? And they say, well, if you're not going to give us equality, we're going to take it, right? And so the men take over control, and instead of taking over control and being like, okay, now we're equals, right? No, now they repress the women and say, see how you like it, right? You go down there, you be our property and our slaves, and we'll see how you like it, right? Because this is how you treated us. Now we're going to treat you like that, right? And so the men take control, and they repress the women and make the male superior, right? And now it's God ordained. Let's rewrite history. Let's rewrite our gods. Male is on top, right? And why? Because this is a saying: knowledge is power. If you are intelligent, typically, as I say, work smarter, not harder. If you can use your intelligence, you can overpower someone that is physically stronger than you with technological advancements. And there's a story somewhere, like there's the David and Goliath story, which is a great show of this. And I think that story has been kind of rewritten. I found out that there's like another version of that somewhere, which is interesting. But in the David and Goliath story, it's this massive giant of a man versus this tiny little boy, and he uses a sling and kills him. Right? And so working smarter, not harder, right? And so knowledge is power. And because the women had the knowledge, they had the power. But then the men got the power, got the knowledge, and therefore were able to take the power back. And because they took the power back, right? Repression is like women are repressed, but over time, history is forgotten and the repression is lessened because, we're all equals, right? I love my wife. I want my wife to be treated fairly, right? And so over time, equality is brought back into society and things are lessened. And now, as you can see in the modern day, things are a lot more equal than my wife is my property, right? It's a lot more equal. And so equality emerges, and eventually we're heading back towards... There's two ways that this can go. We either hold equality and keep it as it is, or as things look to be moving, where we have the whole. There's two things here. We have the whole male loneliness epidemic, where men are very unhappy with the state of things because they feel like they can't find a woman, right? And the women are very unhappy with the men because the men are so pathetic, and they all want the successful and good-looking and physically pleasing attributes of men, right? And so, this is an issue. This is an issue because the women are saying, well, men are trash and scum, right? And the men are saying women, are just, they only want no, like a woman doesn't want me for me, they just want me for my money, right? And things like that. So we have this kind of issue going on here where there's a conflict of who is superior here. And the answer is that we are equals. However, the way things are heading right now, there's a lot of movement towards female dominance. But the problem is that men are not going to go quietly on that, and it could be a big issue. And it's already kind of a whole thing, but that's where we are in the current day. We are in a turmoil where it's pretty much, it's up in the air which way we fall. Will we regress back to where we've been, or will we, I would say, still regress into where we've been, but just back in time? Or will we find the balance again and maintain equality? I don't know. It's hard to say right now. Realistically, we should maintain equality because we are the smartest in theory we've ever been. However, intelligence, as I'm saying, is not wisdom. And so just because you know a lot of stuff doesn't mean you understand it, right? And so that's where we are in the modern day. You know, the civilization potentially for like the women was potentially enlightened, and this is the same thing in today, right? In theory, our civilization is enlightened, but just because some people are wise, it does not mean that everyone in the society is wise. And if just enough people veer off the path, it cascades into a failure, right? And so I think there very well could have been a lot of very wise people in this civilization, this ancient civilization. However, there was also a lot of people that were learned but not wise, and therefore they had the knowledge and the capability to overturn things without the intelligence to realize why they shouldn't. Or the wisdom, I should say. The wisdom to realize why they shouldn't. And so this may happen again in the modern day, you know, return to repression if balance is not found. So, right, if we don't find balance, we could end up with another cycle of repression. And hopefully that's not where we go and we keep things balanced, but it's still up in the air. And another thing I want to say here is, so knowledge of good and evil is potentially, like this whole knowledge of good and evil is potentially one gender is superior to the other. So the knowledge of good and evil is potentially, I mean, it can be tied to other things, but a big factor of it could be that women ate from the knowledge of good and evil first, right? So women became superior first, saw themselves as superior first, right? And then they gave it to, men, right? Adam, then he eats and he goes, yeah, this is good, right? And so then he sees himself as superior, right? The knowledge of good and evil, seeing one as better than the other. And so what happens after this? Well, everything cascades into failure. Everything goes to crap, right? Because now you have conflict, now you have turmoil, and things get destroyed. And so no longer do we live in this peaceful Garden of Eden, right, where there's plenty of abundance and we can do as we please. No, now we're kicked out. We got to struggle and toil and, suffer for our work, right, or for our food. And I think that ties in very heavily with where I'm going with my theory and stuff. And that, this really bases off, like a big basis of this is gender. And so our bodies are now fractured and the death spiral continues, right? So because we no longer see ourselves, we have the knowledge of good and evil, we no longer see ourselves as whole. We see ourselves as half and half, right? We are humans, but those are women and we are men, right? And rather than seeing ourselves as humans, where we're all kind of just humans and we have female and male, tendencies, like we're all, I think the term is gender is a spectrum, and I think that is true. And I think that at the end of the day, your spectrum should be 50-50, right? Whether you're man or female, whether you're a male or female, you should be about a 50-50 split of both tendencies. That is where balance is. And the reason why we need the balance is because balance is just it just is good. Keep, balance, as I said, is good. And I'm like, typically it's best to keep things equal, because when everyone is equal, everyone gets a fair share. And seeing yourself as both male and female, right, there's less hatred for either side, because you see a part of yourself in them and they see a part of themselves in you. And when you have that kind of connection and that relation, it is less likely for there to be any animosity between each other, right? And this goes into, just about everything that humans can have a disagreement over. But right now, because we have this knowledge of good and evil, we see ourselves as, oh, well, I'm superior, right, because of my gender, right? And each side sees themselves as superior, even though we're all humans, right? And so our bodies, in a sense, are fractured, right? They're broken. We have this conception in our mind that is damaging, right? And so we continue to spiral, and societies rise and fall and collapse, and all this stuff, because without balance, life does not abound. As I said on my cycles, right, we're in open loop cycles rather than closed loop cycles. And so without a balance, without equality, without keeping things level, if you have one side higher than the other, it's natural that is then going to flip. It's going to change. If whatever goes up must come down. If everything is flat, level to the ground, nothing changes, nothing happens, all is good. And so what I also want to say is this potentially wise society, if they followed the way, it is no wonder that they died. The way is easily overpowered in the short, but is the truth in the long. So what I also want to say with this is that if some members of this society were wise, but not everyone was, and they followed the way, right? The way basically says non-action, right? And if that's the case, in the long term, eventually it will come to fruition. But in the short term, you're going to die, most likely, right? So these people most likely knew that, and they understood, oh, okay, well, things are going bad, and, we did our best, but this is the way. And so rather than fighting to the bitter end, they just kind of let it happen, potentially. Because I was thinking about how this society falls, and I think it's most likely they were wise enough to realize that it didn't matter. Not truly. But we'll see. I don't know. And the other thing I want to say is God warned us, in the story, God warns us, do not eat of the knowledge of good and evil, right? Because potentially God has already lived through what happens if you do. And they knew you will surely die, because you will be fractured and broken, and you will, your whatever you have will cause chaos, right? You will go from this thing of beauty to chaos and destruction if you eat this knowledge. And I know because I've seen it, right? And so, basically, we didn't heed the warning. And that's fine, because typically, in order to learn things for real, you have to live them, right? As I said in another talk, you don't know until you know, and experience is typically how we figure these things out. And so, unfortunately, a lot of people have to die, and a lot of suffering has to take place for us to realize that this is dumb and it's wrong. And I know that sounds ridiculous, and I know that shouldn't be the case, but overall, how do you learn? You shouldn't burn your hand. Someone may tell you, but you don't know for certain that you're going to burn your hand until you do it. And then well, I'm not doing that again, right? That hurt. And as dumb as you may think a child is for touching something hot, they don't know it's hot. They don't understand what that means, right? And so, as dumb as it is for humans to kill each other and have all these disagreements, they don't understand why yet. And so, as a collective consciousness of humans, we are developing that understanding, but we haven't quite gotten there yet. And I'm hoping it's soon. Because if it's not, then we're pretty much going to be starting from scratch. And, that'd be a shame. But sometimes you gotta keep going through the mistakes to figure it out. So, yeah. Anyway, this one went long, so peace out.